Hello everyone, thank you for attending. Hopefully you're grabbed some lunch and we can get moving. So again, Jamie Weishaar, I'm from PCI Pharma Services. We're a global packaging and logistics provider. So we get the drugs to the clinical sites. We also have a couple of sites, one in the UK and one in Australia, where we do manufacturing of drug product. So the talk that I'm giving today is actually based on a seminar series that we give, where we have a phase 1 unit, we have ourselves, and then we have a CPA financial planning group that come and each gives about a 45-minute talk in the evenings. So it's about a 3-hour conversation, if you will, on running clinical trials in Australia. And what we've done is we've condensed it down to under an hour so that we can talk to smaller groups, talk in more succinctly about running clinical trials. So I will cover some things on the clinical side as well as the financial side that I would dare say I'm not at all an expert in, but we can definitely get you in touch with the experts if you have questions or anything. I'll answer what I can. I've done enough of these with those folks. I can answer quite a few questions, but there are some areas that are definitely not within my expertise. So we'll talk about Australia and running early phase clinical trials. So the typical customer that comes to Australia, they're about 50 or 80%, 77%, 2/3 are biotech companies, and about 1/3 of them are larger pharma companies. And honestly, most of them come from North America. There's a very small pharmaceutical base that's based in Australia where they'll run. A lot of them are more university type institutions. Europe has a few people. If you think about it, Europe is completely on the opposite side of Australia, so it's hard for them to communicate, which I think limits it to a bit. And then within Asia, again, they have a few, but really most everything comes from North America. So why would you go to Australia? So Australia has a regulatory process that is quite a bit accelerated from specifically North America and Europe. So you can get a study approved within 4 to 5 weeks, and you can typically be dosing your first patient within 8 to 10 weeks of submitting your documentation. And that documentation is not as extensive as your typical CTA or an IND. And I'll walk through some of this in a little bit. There's also, it's just a limited CMC package that you need to use. And some of the requirements around your IP, around your, or IMP, your medicinal product, your drug product, are a lot less stringent than what they would be specifically in Europe and also in the US. So in Australia, they have what's called the Clinical Trial Notification Scheme. You're literally notifying the TGA, which is their regulatory agency, that you're running a trial. So the primary aspect of the CTM process is assigned to the ethics committee. So when you go to submit your documentation to get approval for a phase 1 trial in particular, or a phase 2 trial, you don't submit your documentation directly to the TGA. It goes to the Human Research Ethics Committee. So it goes straight to the ethics committee. It doesn't go through the TGA and then they review it. So the ethics committee, they're the ones who approve you to move forward with a clinical trial. They review all of your scientific information. Australia is an ICH recognized country, so all of your preclinical data, your IND-enabling studies, they all have to be the same that would be in the US or in Europe. It's just the way that it's presented. You don't have to present all of that data. But it goes through the ethics committee. The ethics committee is the one that reviews it. They review your trial protocol, your investigation, your investigator's brochure, your patient information, your consent form. And that's pretty much it. So what would normally go in your IND, all of the API information, all of your analytical information, all your drug product, your stability, all that type of information, that doesn't go in there. it's pretty much limited to 2 pages, and that's essentially your pharmacy manual that goes into your investigator's brochure. So again, you submit your paperwork to the ethics committee. There are 2 different types of ethics committee. There are private ethics committees and public ethics committees. The private ones, you pay a little more money. They usually get approved a couple weeks sooner, and you pick and choose who your ethics committee is. But typically you would submit that to the ethics board. It takes them about a week to assign that. They get a couple of weeks to review it, and there's a parallel path between the clinical group that reviews it and like a CMC group that reviews your CMC application. They'll come back to you with comments, questions. That typically back and forth takes a week or 2 until they approve it, and then you would get a certificate that says, yep, the ethics committee has approved this trial to move forward. So then once you get that certificate, that's what you then submit to the TGA and say, hello, Australian TGA, we have our ethics committee certificate. We plan on moving forward with a clinical trial in Australia. And then within 3 to 5 days, you get a note back that says, yep, here's your CTN number, your clinical trial number. It costs 350 Aussie dollars to submit that electronically, and then you're free to start dosing patients from that point on. So it's fairly rapid, and we've done it many times with many companies, and it really does only take, you're usually dosing patients within about 8 to 10 weeks of that. Any amendments that you might have are handled through the ethics committee. Again, you don't go through the TGA. The TGA is not the one that's approving these things. You work through the ethics committee if you have any changes that go forward. There is no requirement to provide ongoing data, like CMC data, to the TGA. So, with an IND, you say, okay, we have a month of stability data, and we'll continue to update you as more data comes available. That's not required. You have to have the data, and if anyone wanted to see the data from the TGA, they can come ask you for it. But it's not a requirement that you continually update like you would do, regular updates to an IND or a CTA. You do need to have a local Australian commercial entity to lodge or to apply for a CTN number. Typically, that's your CRO. Your CRO can be your local Australian-based company that does this for you, and they routinely do. I'll go through later, there are some cost advantages to setting up your own Australian entity if you're going to spend enough money there, but it's not a requirement to do that. One thing that you want to take particular note of is when you file your CTN, you want to make sure that that you include all of the dosage forms and strengths that you think you may use, because that would be the one time that you would need to go back and do an amendment to the HREC, is if you're going to change your dose strength, because obviously they're looking at it and looking at safety of patients. So if you're going to change the dosing that you're going to do, they're going to want to look at that and say, yep, you're still operating within a safe range. So what we would recommend, and what most people would recommend, is that if you think you're going to use a strength, list it in your ethics document. The other thing is if you're using any kind of device or drug that's being used off-label, which clinical trials typically are, especially phase 1, you are dosing a healthy patient with a drug they wouldn't normally take. That needs to go in your CTM form. And that includes things like if you need a pump that is not an approved device in Australia, you want to make sure that that goes into your list, into your filing. Those are the type of things that would trigger you to go back and do an amendment to your CTN filing, to the HREC board. But for the most part, there aren't many amendments that are required or ongoing reporting that you need to do. So as far as the EMA and FDA, so the data has been used in hundreds of trials that you've run the trial in Australia, and then you submit the data for a phase 2 IND or CTA in Europe. we're not aware of any trials that have been run in Australia where the EMA or FDA or any of the other agencies have not accepted that data. I mean, again, it's an ICH country. It's just a little bit of a different regulatory process that they go through, but the data and everything is all the same. They've also been inspected by Anvisa, the Brazilian governments. They have all kinds of audits and things they've gone through. So, once again, don't worry about the quality of the data. The quality of data is there. It's done no differently than you would do a study in the US or in Europe. It's just the way they go through that application to start the trial where it's a little different and a little more streamlined, if you will, than the US and Europe. One thing that makes Australia unique, their phase 1 units are all located in tertiary teaching hospitals or associated with a hospital. So, in the US, you might have a phase 1 unit that's kind of in an office park off by itself. Their phase 1 units are all located within a hospital. They all have relationships with those hospitals, so if there were to be an adverse event, they can have the crash team there within 5 minutes. The other thing that you have access to is you have access to a lot of testing within the hospitals that you might not have access to if you were at a typical phase 1 clinic in the US or Europe. So it's one of the advantages that you can take advantage, that you can look into, especially if you have some sort of diagnostic test that you're wanting to run. Maybe you want to, you're looking at a phase 1, 2A, and you want to get some information. They definitely, being within those hospitals, can run some additional diagnostic tests that you may not be able to get in the US or Europe at a phase 1 unit in particular. So just kind of in summary, you can get a study approved in 4 to 5 weeks. You submit through the ethics committee, not directly through the TGA. There's no IND or CMC section necessarily required. You're usually dosing patients within 8 to 10 weeks from submission. The data is accepted globally, and it is often used to support INDs and CTAs for phase 2 trials. I would say if anyone, the reason to be careful with these is that what a lot of people will do is, I need my next tranche of funding, we've got to get patients, so you run, you get into your patients. If you haven't started your IND, you're going to have phase 1 patient data, and then you're going to have to start writing your IND or your CTA. So you lose a lot of those advantages. You should really be thinking about writing your IND for your phase 2 trials or your CTA for your phase 2 trials while you're running those phase 1 trials, or else you lose a lot of those time advantages, because when you go to the next phase, you're still going to have to submit all that CMC data to the regulatory authorities. So that's the one pitfall with this, is you can sometimes rush ahead, get a lot of phase 1 data, and then you've got to step back and write your IND, and if you haven't started that process, then you've kind of lost a lot of the time that you've gained. But if you need funding, it's a great way to get into patients quickly and get that funding moving forward. So now I'll talk about some of the specific requirements for importing and manufacturing. I've kind of mentioned some of this. So for importation into Australia, so you can import the API or the finished product. It's a very simple process. You really just need a pro forma invoice and a packaging slip, and an MSDS, of course. As long as it goes to a TGA GMP licensed facility, like PCI, it can be received before you have the CTN number. Obviously, if you can get a CTN number in 4 weeks, but you can't get the drug in the country for 3 months, the scheme doesn't work. So that's one of the pragmatic things that they've said, is that you can bring the drug in before you have your CTN number. So ship the drug in. It can't go to the site. It can't go to the clinical site. It has to go to a GMP warehouse. But that's one of the easy things for getting drug in. So a few things about that. The sponsor who signs the CTM form takes responsibility for oversight and use of that. IMP, that drug, as it comes in, any recalls, which for clinical trials there shouldn't be many recalls, but if you have comparator in your trial, and then any of the serious adverse event updates. Again, typically your sponsor will be your CRO, unless you decide to set up your own entity, and even then sometimes you'll use the CRO to be that sponsor. So that CTN acknowledgement just allows you to conduct the trial in the way that the ethics board has approved, so you can use drugs in a non-approved manner. And again, there's no IND, there's documentation required. Just that IB protocol, the IB in the protocol is where most of that information resides. So the pro forma invoice, when you submit it in, importer of record, again, Australian business entity, someone like PCI, someone like your CRO. You just have to have someone in Australia that's responsible for the drug. You do have to supply a commercial value. There is a 10%, they call it GST, it's like VAT. There's a 10% tax that you'll have to pay. It is paid by the importer of record, so your CRO may pay that and then charge you. Just work that out before you bring it in. There is the HS code required. That's pretty simple. You can look that up online. There are no import duties that are levied on the IMP or the placebo. The funny thing is a few years ago they used to levy duties on placebo and not on the IMP. They changed that. They got pragmatic, changed it 3 to 5 years ago. So there are no duties, but there is GST tax. And then other things, it takes about 48 to 72 hours to get the drug to Australia. It's obviously a long ways to go. You really will, we recommend that you ship early in the week. That way if there are any holdups, it's not showing up at a site over a weekend, especially if it's any kind of temperature controlled shipments. We also would recommend that you use a high-level courier, someone like a World Courier or a Markin, somebody that really has done this before. They might be a little more expensive, but a couple of things that they'll do for you is they'll obtain pre-clearance, so before the drug shows up to customs, they'll have already talked to the customs agents and make sure that they're aware it's coming and get it through smoother. The other thing that we've found, especially in a place like Australia, is some of these companies will not have people locally, and they'll try to just deal with any issues over email. And so they don't have relationships necessarily with the customs brokers. And so, they send an email from Europe, you got 12 hours before somebody in Australia reads it, and then they respond, you got another 12 hours. Things can drag on. So World Courier, Markin, those kind of people, we would just recommend that you make sure and pay a little bit of extra money to those couriers. You'll sleep better at night knowing that the drug will get through, and they'll deal with all the pre-clearance for you. So there are certain products that do require import permits. They're antibiotics, controlled drugs, and biological products. So they're fairly easy to lodge these, and I'll go through them, but you do have to have a legal entity again to apply. Someone like your CRO, someone like PCI can do that for you. And then that legal entity requires that they have a poisons license, which again, most people that are handling drugs will have those. Again, similar to the US, they have state agencies and they have federal agencies. So the TGA is a federal agency. The states, each unit, like Victoria and things, they have their own state licenses, and that's what this is a drugs and poisons license that's state run. So each if you're working with like a CRO that has multiple locations around Australia, each of their locations is going to have its own state license in order to bring drug in. They all do. It's a small place, but just something to consider. So antibiotics, you have to have an import application. It's just really email this application to the TGA. It typically takes a day or two. It's the form on the right, that's the extent of it. You just put the generic name over there. It is only valid for a single shipment, but it only takes a day or two to get that import permit, so not too bad. And you want to get that, obviously, You can get it way ahead of time that the trial begins, before you have a CTN number. Biologicals, they have a specific biocon permit that you go through. This one does take about a month. It's 30 days. We've even seen it take 6 weeks when they've gotten busy, but typically it's 30 days. The nice thing about that permit is that it's valid for 2 years, and you can bring drug in multiple times on one permit. It's pretty simple. Again, it's like things like the product name, brief description, very brief description of how it's manufactured, what type of cells, those things, not the entire, IND, CMC section. Manufacturer's name, country of origin, those types of things. You do want to put what conditions it needs to be stored at. That's important. That's how they'll know when they do any kind of audit that it's been handled correctly. And then your importer of record will need to have that biocon number on the incoming documentation before it shows up at the door, or it will be rejected. But pretty standard stuff. It's not difficult. There is now a generic biologics permit that PCI does have if you're importing drug product, that we can receive the drug on based on the generic permit. If it's bulk drug substance that's going to be further processed, then it needs a permit. But if it's bulk drug product already in neat vials that somebody's just going to label and ship to the clinical sites, there is now a mechanism where there's a generic blank permit. PCI has one. Other folks would have them as well. But just so you know. Controlled substances is the only thing that you can't ship before you actually have a CTN number. So because they're worried about diversion of those products, you do have to have your CTN number before you can bring in controlled substances into Australia. Again, it is a fairly simple process online, but this one is also, it's only valid for short amounts of time, and it's every time you want to import a batch of drug, you have to get a new permit. It's, they're drugs that can be diverted. They want to keep control of what's coming in and where it's going. One unique thing about Australia is they do require an export permit. So a lot of people like ourselves will use Australia as our Asia Pacific hub to ship drug all over that region. So it is a great place. You're in Australia, you've got reliable power supplies, you've got people that know what they're doing, those kinds of things. And we can get it to New Zealand overnight. It does take a couple of days to get to Korea, Japan, Taiwan, any of the other countries, because you think you're in Asia Pacific, but if you look on a map, Australia and Taiwan are quite a ways different. They're not right next to each other, so it is a longer plane flight. So you do have to obtain an export license in order to export drug to other countries. Again, it's a fairly simple process. It takes about a week. It's good for 2 years. The big thing about this is that you have to report every 6 months where that drug is gone. So you're taking on the responsibility, whoever's shipping that drug, that's saying you're shipping it to a place that's going to run a clinical trial, that they're following GMPs, da-da-da-da-da. So then they just ask you that every 6 months you send them a report that says, yep, we sent this much drug to this facility and it was used appropriately. People will handle that for you, but just be aware that there is such a thing as an export permit. Most countries don't require this, but Australia does. It's not onerous, but be aware of it. So now we'll talk about some of their manufacturing and regulatory requirements around CMC. So within Australia, phase 1 trials are not subject to GMP facility licenses. So Australia, used to be a colony of Britain. They follow a lot of the same rules that the Europeans follow, that the MHRA founded. But one place where they really differ is on phase 1. So TGA does audit and does license facilities. They will give you, this is a TGA certificate, this facility is licensed. Europe does that, the US does not. The US will come in, audit your facility and say, yep, you meet standard, but they don't give you a license. So in Australia, for phase 1 trials, you do not have to manufacture your drug at a licensed GMP facility. You definitely want it to be done per GMPs. You don't want to cut any corners or anything like that, but it doesn't have to go to a GMP licensed facility. This really opened them up more along the lines, I like to think of it as like compounding pharmacies. For phase 1, you wouldn't want to have to go get a GMP license for your clinical pharmacy at your phase 1 facility. You know, that's not what they're set up for, is GMP manufacturing. They're set up for compounding. So this kind of lowers that bar a little bit, so that the pharmacist is responsible at the phase 1 unit. They're obviously going to do it in the appropriate manner, but it's not a requirement of the Australian government. Phase 2 and above, it's got to be done at a GMP licensed facility or an approved facility like in the US, where it's been audited and so forth. This approach is very similar actually to the US approach. So if you look in the guidances, the US, there is some gray area there that would say, oh, it doesn't have to be GMP, but everyone here tests the drug after they make it. They don't necessarily in Australia, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And in Europe, it has to be at a licensed facility. So oftentimes in a phase 1, you're doing a SAD MAD study, and it's like, okay, we've got our 8 patients, and we need to give them this drug, and it's at 5 milligrams, and we're going to give it to them, and then we're going to wait, and then we're going to see. So especially in Europe, you would have to make 100 5 milligram capsules, put it on stability. You'd have to have that stability so that it could go on the label of what your expiry dates are, on and on and on and on. So what they do a lot in Australia is they'll just fill 10 capsules with 5 milligrams of drug. They'll go dose the patients with those 10 capsules. They'll get the readout from the drug. And then the next week they'll decide, do we go up to 15? Do we need to go to 10? And so then they'll just manufacture 10 more capsules. That's where this requirement, not having the requirements for all of the testing and the GMP really comes into play in Australia, where you can be really flexible. We do just-in-time manufacturing. We do about 30 studies a year. Other folks do it. The phase 1 folks, their clinical pharmacies, they'll do some of this. Sometimes they just outsource to us because they don't want to mess with it. Usually this is for oral suspension solutions, powder and capsule, just neat API in a capsule. It's very common to do. There are no QP requirements in Australia. They do have a thing that's an authorized person, but it's exactly the same as what in the US when you just have your quality group issues a letter that says, yep, we release this for clinical use. We do have authorized people on our staff. Most of the clinical sites, those clinical pharmacists are authorized people. You want to make sure that who is going to release it. You want to make sure that somebody's been identified that is an authorized person, but it's not in any way a QP. They don't go through all the testing, any of those things. It really is more of a quality function. And then, again, you can't ship to the site until you have that CTN number and it's available. You can keep it at a warehouse or the manufacturer. You can't actually send it to the clinical site, which is also why a lot of phase 1 units will outsource back to a manufacturing facility, because they just really want to dose the patients, and if they have to wait for the CTN number and then they manufacture, it's easier just to have a manufacturing company do that for you. So for the authorized person to release, it's really phase specific. So what I mentioned earlier with making 10 capsules, the way they do the release, it's based on the API C of A and the batch record. That's all they review. If it's a sterile product, they'll also run a sterility test, and then you'll get that data back. But there is no requirement that you actually test your drug product for assay or impurities. They believe pragmatically that that is captured in your API, C of A. So that's all that your qualified person, your quality group's going to look at is, look at, yep, you follow the batch record, yep, you've got a potency of 98% on your API, you did what you were supposed to do, therefore, go ahead and dose the patient. Oftentimes people will keep a dose back, and then if they get weird readouts, then they will test some of those test articles after the fact, just to confirm that the dose was correct, but it's not a requirement. Phase 2 and beyond testing, everything's got to be manufactured, tested, batch records, the whole 9 yards. But phase 1, not a requirement. That I've kind of gone over. The other thing that most people will do is they'll run an engineering batch, obviously, ahead of time. And they will put those up on short-term stability where they'll just leave it on the bench. They don't have to put it in an ICH chamber. They'll just put it on the bench top to show that we've got in-use stability. We've got 2 weeks of stability, or whatever it is, a month. But it can be as little as 1 week. So typically that's handled within the demo batch. Any questions so far? All right. So now labeling requirements. So there are a few specific labeling requirements in Australia. They're not onerous. So labeling is technically a GMP step. So it has to be conducted at a manufacturing site, specifically phase 2 and above. So shelf life extensions are different. In Europe, you would have to take the drug, ship it back to a manufacturing site, and do a shelf life extension, expiry labeling extension. In Australia, you don't. You have to do the initial labeling at a facility, a manufacturing facility, but expiry extensions can just be done at the clinic. So another place where they've gone a little pragmatic. Typically what happens is whoever your packager is will print out the labels and ship it to the clinical site, and then the clinical site will just go through and label. You can harmonize a New Zealand and Australian label. It's fairly easy. It's even easy to harmonize with the US and typically Europe. Not a problem. It's all in English. It's pretty straightforward. So this is kind of what a typical clinical label would look like. It's got your warning label. It's got, if the medication is taken home, it's got directions for use. It's got multiple sites. You might leave that blank to say, yep, this is for site, this clinical site, that clinical site. You can write that information in. You do have to have a retest date. It doesn't have to be an expiry date. It's a retest date. So this is another interesting thing about Australia is if you only have 2 weeks of stability data, you put 2 weeks. This needs to be retested in 2 weeks. So then at the end of those 2 weeks, you can retest it. Let's say you're just not enrolling as quickly as you thought, or something happened, the coronavirus happened, and the patients couldn't come in for a week, so you've got to delay it. You can just retest that and then extend the expiry. So it's truly a retest date. It's not truly an expiry date, which is different from the way Europe sees it. The batch number is required, the route of administration if it's not a tablet, and then your Australian commercial sponsor is required. That's probably going to be your CRO. Again, unless you have set up your own business number and those types of things, your CRO is typically going to be the person who's listed on that label. They're the responsible party within Australia for that drug. So as I mentioned, shelf life extensions, it is not considered a GMP step. It can be done at the clinic. Typically, they like to see you strike that label, strike out that date, and put the new expiry date and repeat the batch number, just so they've got some kind of check and balance. Pretty simple. So that was the original label design. Can anybody see how we would improve that label design? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the expiry labeling. So if we put the expiry date on the left-hand side, which is there, it's going to be really hard to line that out and have some tag on it that says, here's our new retest date. So you really want to put the retest date on the right side, not the left side of that label. Practical things. These are the things that always trip you up halfway through and you go, oh my goodness, how did I ever, why are we relabeling everything when all we need to do is this one little thing? Well, it's those kind of little things that you don't think about that can get you in the end. So just something to keep in mind. You wouldn't have had to have gone back to the manufacturer to label. But in this case, how are we going to do this? So next I can move into the tax incentives, if no one has any questions about the CMC aspects or the clinical aspects.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have just one question about, does Australia abide or have they signed on to any of the increased privacy requirements for data, the GDPR stuff that's showing up in Europe?
Typically they follow Europe. I don't know if they've actually signed anything, but typically they follow the guidance from Europe on those types of things. I would have to check.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know you're switching into the other approach. Well, you've talked about companies can set up their own subsidiary, say, but let's say you do it through PCI or another CRO. You can negotiate presumably ownership of the information so that the sponsor owns the information.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. None of these entities would own the information whatsoever. It's just who's responsible for the drug when it's in country. But the information would absolutely still remain with the sponsor company, yeah. Yeah, it's just more around when if the TGA says, this happened, we want to know who's responsible, who do they come ask? Do they come you or do they come to the sponsor company? Yeah, for sure. So now is the cost part of it, the part everybody likes to hear about and the accountants love to talk about. So right now, the Aussie dollar is fairly weak against the US dollar. So just Forex exchange, it's about, about 1.4 Aussie dollars is for every US dollar. So it's kind of, when I go over there, it's kind of like every US dollar I give them, it's like 70 cents on the dollar, however that, I don't know how that figures out, but I always look at it kind of everything's about 30% on sale, if you will. So the Forex is really in our favor right now. If you are going to do this as a strategy, then you'd want to get with the accountants and figure out a wholesale market to get the best rate that you can to get the money converted, But right now, even if you just paid with US dollars, you're getting a much better deal because of the Forex exchange. You're also, the obvious thing is your cash burn. If you can get in the clinic within 2 months versus 6 months to a year that it might take in the US or Europe, you've reduced your cash burn. There are some costs with setting up an Australian entity, but if you set up an Australian entity, you can take advantage of a 43.5% cash rebate. This is not a tax break. It's an actual cash rebate that you can get back and you can spend anywhere in the world. There are no requirements to keep it in Australia. From all the clients we've talked to and everything that we've looked at, you need to spend at least $1 million in Australia before it really makes sense to set up an entity and all that. But if you're going to run a clinical trial, I mean, those are typically well over $1 million, so you're going to take advantage of this. And, to get 43.5% back on your dollar that you can reinvest into any kind of work that you want to do anywhere in the world, it's worth looking into. So the background on this, yeah.
So if PCI were to run it for an American company, would you get that credit and could you pass some, you don't?
No.
Why
No.
is that?
Well, we're not the sponsor, so we are an Australian entity, but we are not doing any novel research. We are doing it on behalf of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So the way it's set up is that we would have to be the ones doing the research in order for us to recoup it. So if we're doing it on someone else's behalf, I know in Europe a lot of times they have some tax advantages that they can take, that you get like your GST or your VAT tax refunded. It's a different scheme than that. So that's not how this one works. So yeah, unfortunately we can't do that for you. You would have to do it for yourselves. Yeah.
So on the cost that you incur of R&D, you get 43% back. Is that?
That's correct.
But is it so? how is the control of what is an R&D cost?
I'll go into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that. So the background of this scheme is that back in the 80s, the Australians weren't getting access to HIV medicines and early cancer medicines. Their population was missing out on a lot of this early research. They have a small population. They used to have, and they still do have, a scheme that's exactly like the Europeans. They call it a CTX, which is exactly like the CTA that you would go through in Europe. And people just weren't bothering with it because, one of the other things about Australia, because they have a smaller population, unless you're in like a melanoma trial where they have a lot of melanoma, there aren't a lot of patients in Australia, or you have to travel long distances to go find those patients. So people were just bypassing Australia. They were like, well, if it takes us the same amount of time, it's the same amount of cost, we'll just run it in Europe, we'll just run it in the US. So all of these schemes were somewhat pragmatically put in place because 25 years ago, they were getting overlooked for early research. So this is also not just for pharma. If you want to develop software, the same scheme applies. Anything that you can say is novel research, you can apply this scheme to. So it's not specific to pharma. It's been in place for over 25 years. They've paid out in excess of $3 billion. The other criteria is you have to be a smaller company. So if your company has revenues of less than $20 million Australian, which is about $14 million US, you can apply and get credit for this as a cash rebate. If you have more money, if you generate more money than that, then it becomes a tax incentive. And it's 38.5%, and it carries towards your tax burden the following year. So it's also set up specifically for small companies, small to mid-sized companies who are pre-revenue or early revenue companies. So that's where they're trying to generate, research and development within Australia. They're trying to get those drugs. A lot of times if you haven't run a clinical trial in a country, then you can't sell the drug in that country. So if you run early phase 1 trials, you've met that criteria where you've run trials with that drug in the country, so it's easier for you to get approved to bring your drug into Australia, New Zealand. So those are a lot of the reasons why they've generated this R&D tax scheme. And it's fairly simple, the application process. I mean, you set up your legal entity, you spend the money over a year's period, then at the end you submit your taxes. You have quarterly taxes to submit. Then at the end of the year you file your documents that say, this is what we spent, this is our R&D expenditure, and within a month or two they send you a check back for, if it's $1 million, it's $435,000. Here's a check. We hope you continue to spend it here in Australia, but carry on. We want you to keep doing research. I'm oversimplifying it because I'm not an accountant, but it is essentially that simple. It's really just you file it, and then you can get audited. You don't want to cheat on these things, but it's a pretty low bar to meet. So what is eligible for an R&D tax credit? So they have to be experimental. You can't know the answer before you run the experiment. It has to meet the core activities test. So again, you have to gain knowledge. They must be carried out using a scientific-based method. Duh, I mean, we're scientists. And you have to be trying to generate new knowledge of some sort, new products, new something. That's where software comes in. It can't be a Me Too product. Examples of core activities in pharma, we're talking preclinical and toxicology, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. If you're trying to do some kind of novel formulation development, develop a novel technology, novel imaging technology, those kind of things. If you're doing prototyping work, those would all qualify. So then what would be, so I'm going to run a phase 1 trial. So what qualifies? Well, it's essentially, your salary, your wages, if you have contractors, if you have travel, depreciation and balance adjustments, other costs that directly relate to that R&D activity can be considered. So your CRO costs, your investigator costs, all those types of activities are eligible for your R&D. So your salaries as well as the actual expenditures that you use are eligible. So then the supporting activities to those would be things like if you attend a conference, you can use that as part of your expenditures. If you go over there to scout clinical sites, that trip you can put towards this R&D thing. Trial monitoring, project planning, all those kinds of things. Like just anything that directly relate to that activity. If you have a cost for it that you can document, you can say, yep, this is an R&D activity. The other interesting thing about this is it doesn't just include things that you do in Australia. You can also include things that cannot be done in Australia that directly relate to that core activity being done in Australia. So one of the biggest examples is pre-IND toxicology studies. Australia is an island. They don't want you bringing genetically modified animals onto their island. So therefore, about the only kind of animal research you can do are mouse and rats. And they're typically not GLP level facilities. They're a lot of times done at universities where they're just doing some early research. You can also make the argument that says, why would I set up my bioanalytical expensive method in a place that can only do a third of what I really need done in order to lodge an IND or to get all the data to move forward with a clinical trial. So there are things like that you apply ahead of time and you say, look, I can't find primates in Australia. I need to do this work, and before I can run a phase 1 trial, I want to include this as part of my R&D, and I want to claim that cost as part of my R&D tax rate, and they will allow it. You just need to get a letter from someone in Australia, we've written them for people before, that says, yes, this cannot be done in Australia, so this should apply. So there are several things, some facilities, equipment. The biggest one that I've seen is that pre-IND enabling animal studies that then you can use to say, I have to do this before I run a phase 1 trial. What happens a lot of times is people find out about this as they're ready to run their phase 1 trial, and you needed to have your Australian business set up before you started those and have applied and said, hey, I'm going to do this. You can't do it after the fact. You have to have said, I'm going to do this for this reason, and lodge that with the tax authorities. So some people just miss out on this because they're not aware of it.
And does the Australian company have to pay the outside of Australia expenses, or can the parent U.S. company pay them?
So typically what happens is you set up that Australian entity, and then all of your contracts run through that Australian entity. I have a slide a little later. When you exit, there are some considerations that you want to talk to the accountants about how the IP is set up, so that if the company is wholly absorbed, if someone comes and buys the US and the Australian entity, it's not a problem. If they only buy one part of the company, then your accountants want to make sure that the accountants know that, so that you don't take a tax hit on the backside. Although, if you're getting your company sold and it's at enough, taxes might not be the thing you're really worried about. But it's important, and you just want to make sure when you set up those entities that you do it in the appropriate manner. But yes, you do run your contracts all through the Australian entity.
But is that because you have to return that money in certain instances?
You don't have to return the money, but you would have to pay taxes as an Australian business on the gains that you would make in certain instances, depending on how that exit occurs. I'm happy to put you in touch with Prime Financial, who's our partners, and they can explain all this to you. I've got a couple of slides on it, but this is where I'm really out of my depth, is tax law and things like that. But I just know that it is a major consideration that you do have to make sure that you have those legal entities set up correctly. The way you contract through your Australian entity, and when you exit, you just want it set up appropriately from the beginning so that you don't have some sort of tax implication at the end. And there's a couple slides I'll get into it, but I'm going to just be honest with you. I'm not an accountant. So in order to obtain this R&D rebate, you have to obtain and file a tax number. You have to set up a business, an Australian business. You do have to pay quarterly taxes, or at least submit your quarterly business statements like you would in anywhere else. You do have to have a director that is in Australia. So a lot of times what they do is they find experienced industry professionals that are retired, and then you hire them on a contract basis. They become your Australian director. You, of course, put 2 or 3 of your own people onto the board so that you have the voting rights over them. But hopefully, there's a lot of pharma that goes on in Australia, so hopefully you find someone that you can benefit from and that you can get advice from. But you do have to have a director that is based in Australia, that is Australian, as part of your board. They're the ones who physically sign off on your tax numbers. And I know that Prime Financial has a group of these folks that they can put you in touch with too if you're interested in it. And then you annually lodge your R&D taxes, and you just have to submit your quarterly statements and hold meetings and all those kinds of things. Yeah.
I was just going to say, our company did this, and we worked with a director who's terrific. So if anybody wants a referral, I'd be happy to give you one.
Great, thank you. So just one of the case studies, I've got a couple of case studies to show how this works. So there was an early stage entity established to develop a device to treat varicose veins. Prime Financial, they assisted the company to claim the prototype development activities in the US for the R&D tax incentive because they couldn't do that prototyping in Australia. So they conducted the clinical trial of the device in Australia. The total eligible product was around $11 million, and they got a refund of around $5 million back. It's cash, they can use it anywhere in the world. The one stipulation is you have to spend more money in Australia than you do outside of Australia, or you can't claim the entire amount. You can't do $20 million in the US and $1 million in Australia and claim $21 million. You do have to do the majority of the work in Australia when you do outside. So another case study, there was a San Francisco that did an inhalation treatment for heart conditions. They established the subsidiary. They claimed the animal tox studies that were conducted in the US and the clinical phase 1 was conducted in Australia. They spent around $8 million and they got a $3.4 million cash rebate that again they could spend on whatever. So we've done this many times, many people have done this, it works. So again, issues to consider. You definitely want to know who owns the IP from that R&D activities. You just want to make sure that you've talked to the group and that that's clear, so that when you go to any kind of commercialization or if you're acquired, you just make sure that you know what the tax implications are and what your exit options are. So if you're acquiring the global group, if an acquirer buys 100% of the US parent and that includes the Australian entity, there's no tax that you pay in Australia. If they acquire everything, it doesn't get separated out. If you only buy the Australian subsidiary, then there's no tax that's due in Australia. But there are nuances to that depending on how that sale occurs. So just please talk to the financial people before, as you set that up. And that's me. Do you have any questions I can answer? Yeah.
So for clinical trials, demographics are very important. Do you have any data on that? Ages, prevalence of diseases, ethnicities?
So we do. I don't. The phase 1 groups definitely do. I can say ethnicities. Obviously, you can do they do a lot of ethnopharmacology trials there, especially with Asian populations. They don't have a lot of patients. They have a lot of healthy normals. They don't have a lot of patients unless it's something like melanoma. Melanoma, they have lots of patients, but otherwise, that's where you kind of, when you start getting into phase 2, you usually have to expand your trial into Europe or the US or somewhere to get a larger patient population to hit the numbers.
What is the population of Australia?
I don't know that, to be honest with you.
75 million.
Yeah. So, yeah.
You guys also work in medical devices?
So my company can do the storage and distribution of medical devices. Nucleus Network is our phase 1 partner. I have no idea what they do with devices. Prime Financial absolutely works with devices. If they're EpiPens and things, we do lots with that. But if you're really talking about like heart valves and things, then
Yeah, that's two.
yeah, we could receive them and store them. Typically, you can find less expensive options for devices. To be fair, the regulations for us to store and distribute pharmaceuticals typically means that our storage and distribution prices are higher. But we could. There's nothing that says we couldn't. And I'd be happy to ask around some of my colleagues and see if they know
Okay.
of people, yeah. Yeah.
Is there a correlate to what you mentioned about therapeutics for software? Is there something that developing software cannot be done in Australia, or no?
Oh no, you can develop software in Australia, absolutely. Again, and you can claim that R&D tax credit so long that it's a novel and you can demonstrate that you're doing something that is new and expanding the knowledge and all those kind of things. You just can't make another Facebook.
What
Is
you
this
mentioned-
pre-approved? Do you need to be or when in the process you say you can
I don't
say,
know.
hey, I'm novel or not?
I don't know. I think you would really want to talk to the accountants. I don't know where you would draw the line if this is a Me Too product and this is a software that's novel and it's advancing the knowledge of the world. Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, therapeutics, you had mentioned you could submit a much